All right, everyone. I'm Lucy Handley of the Ridgefield Library, and tonight I'm very happy to welcome back Dr. Mark Schenker, Dean Emeritus of Yale College, who is a frequent contributor with many interesting lectures. And tonight he's got the first one in a series of three on explorative literature in different forms. And tonight we're going to talk about Cloud Cuckoo Land. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Lucy, and thank you for inviting me back to do another series. So when Lucy sent me the description of this series for literature for adults about a topic that can be equally engaging to children, not these books, but the topic, I immediately thought of Cloud Cuckoo Land, a few years old now, which I think is a masterpiece. I'll just preview, since we're doing Cloud Cuckoo Land, that Their Eyes Are Watching God takes the issue of discovery and applies it to self-discovery of a African American woman in Florida coming to a realization of her selfhood as a Black woman and as a person in general. That's next time. And we conclude with Out Stealing Horses by a Scandinavian writer named Pedersen, Per Pedersen, that is set during contemporary time, but looks back to the Second World War and is essentially a book about a man who's not looking to explore and discover and whose past gets him rather than the other way around. So Anthony Doerr, you probably know, won the Pulitzer Prize for All the Light We Cannot See. He's written other novels and short stories. I recommend to you a book called The Shell Collector, early in his career, a collection of short stories. And he wrote this book while researching other books, including ancient Greek literature. This is set partly in a public library in Idaho, because he lived in Idaho for years and was the writer in residence in Idaho. So I want to take the mega approach to this book. This is a book about a book that a man writes and opens, sending it to his sick niece, wishing her good health and anyone else who finds it. So it's a book about a book. And that book is written fictively. There is no Cloud Cuckoo Land as a book, by a writer who actually existed, Antonius Diogenes. And it's believed he wrote a book that was called Beyond Wonders Beyond Thule, Thule. Thule is the word that the Greeks and Romans gave to the most northern part of the livable world, somewhere in Scotland or Scandinavia. Ultima Thule, you may have heard that expression, is the utmost part of the inhabitable but not yet civilized world. So he wrote this book about wonders of places people have never been. Remember, that's essentially what the Odyssey is about. It's an excuse to give a travelogue of strange creatures in strange places. So it moves from 2nd century AD to the 15th century and the fall of Constantinople, a significant event in Western history, the end of the Ottoman Empire. And we see their two children who become central not only to the plot about Constantinople, but inquisitive Anna gets hold of a manuscript that becomes the centerpiece of this book. So the niece who's invoked in the prologue that this book is for, the orphan girl Anna, and the cleft palate boy shepherd Omir, and I only refer to his cleft palate because he's ostracized for that reason. He's conscripted into the attacking army, and they become friends and then more. And he makes it his life business to protect that manuscript for the sake of Anna. And I will say that this book is not only dedicated to librarians, but is completely suffused with the idea that now in the 21st century, when books are not what they were, when writing is not what it was, I have a cartoon on my desk upstairs that shows a young man asking a reference librarian holding up a book. How do I turn this on? So more and more people not being not only book learned, but aware of books. And it's a celebration that in every time of human history, there is disease and warfare and captivity and discrimination. People naturally are looking for a utopia, some kind of Shangri-La, this cuckoo land. And it turns out that in the course of this story, Athon, who goes through several transformations, from a donkey to a fish to a crow so that he can go up to the clouds, turns out is not happy with Cloud Cuckoo Land because without obstruction, without illness, without challenges and burdens, life's not life. And so the overarching message of the book, to the extent that there is a message, and I don't think the book is just reduced to its message, is a celebration of how much we must put into preserving the past. And a number of the reviewers who liked this book, and it was many, talked about how it shows different ways in which hard work, study, love, luck go into keeping something preserved. And in this book, the manuscript, as is often the case, of Cloud Cuckoo Land, that story of Athon going through his journeys and transformations, is missing passages. And part of what Zeno does with the students, the 5 students in his library group, is to try to figure out what might go there if we don't know for sure. And here I want to say a word about translation. Most people think of translation only in the sense of from one language to another, but I'm a great believer and have been all of my professional life as a teacher and a dean, that translation is one of the best skills you can have. How do you tell someone who's from a completely different culture from yours that they're sick with something like mental illness if their culture doesn't have a way of thinking about mental illness except in some supernatural way? How do physicians translate what they know into something the other person can understand? You have people in your orbit, people in your family who you know you have to talk to a certain way. You don't necessarily have to treat them with kid gloves, but you have to talk to them differently because they're different from you. And even though you're close to them and you love them, maybe they're a different generation, maybe they are a different sensibility, but you have to translate what you're doing into what they can understand. Another simple thing is that if you love your grandmother's meatball recipe, and it turns out they no longer make that kind of tomato, or there's no longer the kind of parsley she had in Italy here, what do you do to change it to keep it the same? And in fact, the French word for translate, traduire, T-R-A-D, is the same root as tradition. The only way you can keep a tradition up is by changing it one way or another. And this book goes through a series of changes in an effort, either knowingly or unknowingly, to preserve this manuscript that is a wacky story imagined by Doerr as, again, a real writer who wrote a book like this, but this is not that book, and then takes it not only into 20th century Idaho, but into 20th century space, or what we think is space. If you haven't read the book, there will be spoilers here, so just know that, and that will be true for all the books we're doing. So Constantinople, Idaho, a public library, a logical place for a book about books to be set, but significantly Zeno, the old man, that's how he's described, who is a former POW during the Korean War, is a gay man who met another gay man, Rex, while imprisoned. That man had an abiding interest in Greek and Greek translation. Zeno picked up the bug, and that's why he's able to do the work he does in the library. A significant figure in the Idaho frame of the book is Seymour, a teenage boy who is clearly on the spectrum, who loves things about Greek language, but also loves animals and nature. He has the kind of obsessive love of a narrow range of natural or technological life that is true of many students, many people on the spectrum, especially young men. He becomes central to the story because they are destroying the woods that he loves. The company that is destroying those woods is named Eden Realty, and Eden there is, of course, a play on utopia. The book is partly an argument against having pie in the sky ideas of utopia. You can write a book, you can imagine something extraordinary. The book is not against imagining perfection. It's not against imagining the zany and the wacky. This is a very wacky, inventive, audacious book. But it wants to warn us that if we think we're going to find that Eden, that utopia, that Shangri-La in everyday life, we're mistaken. There's too much hard work, there's too much destruction, disease, animosity, captivity, war, all of that. That's part of the deal. But part of the deal also is books and reading and the community that books bring to each other. So the last phase after Idaho is a teenage girl named Constance who has been quarantined inside a spaceship because the rest of the people on board have gotten a disease. There's a lot of disease in the book, a lot of deformity, a lot of not fitting in. Her name is Constance with a K, but that shouldn't blind us to the fact that Constantinople has the same root. Constantinople was named after Emperor Constantine, and the final protagonist of the book is a teenage girl named Constance. So there are 5 central characters if we leave out Athon, the fictional character who's going on that journey to Cloud Cuckoo Land. They're the 2 young people in Constantinople. There's Seymour in the Idaho version, time frame. There's Zeno, who's not young, and then there's Constance. So a lot of this book is carried by young people, the people for the future. Zeno turns out to be significant not only because he is the linchpin in the Greek translation, as Constance is going to be by virtue of a virtual library, but he's the hero of the book because he does an extraordinary thing, adventurous in this speculative novel about the future, by saving the children from an explosion, killing himself in the process. Quite remarkable in the variety of genres that this book works in. So Constance is not only a play on Constantinople, Constantine, but also on the notion of constant. She's the one who survives the false spaceship. She's the one who becomes a mother, moves to a village where she has a pre-industrial village where she lives close to the land, has a son, and her last act is reading to that son. And you may not remember, because you might not have struggled to pronounce it out loud, the name of the place that she winds up in. I'm going to just take a second. I'm not asking you to say it out loud, but can you visualize the name of that village, that pre-industrial village she winds up in after she leaves Argos? It's Q-A-A-N-A-A-Q. Quinac, however you might pronounce it. Very foreign, not spelled like the language of any language that I know. But one thing's clear, it leaps out at you, it's a palindrome. It reads the same forwards and backwards. Well, Constance, who winds up with the book, as it were, and is central in helping the people in Idaho through AI work, figure out how to complete the manuscript. She's the last purveyor of the manuscript. But the first was the inquisitive Anna, who took a manuscript because she wants to learn how to read. And so the first child who's involved in the manuscript has a palindromic name. Anna is the same backwards and forwards. Constance is not, but we've already said she's Constant, and she winds up in a village that is a palindrome. Why a palindrome? Because she went on a trip and wound up back where she began because she didn't go anywhere. Where are you going to wind up if you wind up in the same place you started effectively? You make a word that's a palindrome. That's just, it's not gimmicky. It's just a celebration in language of someone who is very verbal, very textual, has an imagination that's suffused with language and not just images. So Constance is constant, and this book runs from Anna's acquisition of the manuscript to Constance helping to finish it and have it a story that she can tell to her son and tell him that it's true. The book runs the gamut from A to Z, and I'm going to make a joke now that I'm sure the author intended. It runs from Anna to Zeno. It covers the spectrum, and it is not suggesting that life is a bowl of cherries, and it acknowledges all kinds of problems in the 21st century world, ranging from homelessness to children on the spectrum to discrimination against gay people to the problem of single mothers and trying to support their children, and on and on and on. The idea of how many people are incarcerated or held captive at one time or another, either in war, like Rex and Zeno, or in prison, as Seymour winds up at the end, or locked in a safe, like Constance. And if you've ever in your life been incarcerated or held captive, even if it's in quarantine, and I'm not being glib now, even if you had to suffer with not being able to go out, or you've had in your life times when you've been prevented from living in the usual way, you know how much words and language, books maybe, but maybe other kinds of communication through language matters. And here we have, through the magic of AI, this book is only a few years old, Constance being able to communicate from what she thinks is space back in time to an older man and 5 children in an Idaho library. Really quite remarkable. So this idea of the persistence of documents is something that many writers and readers love. Many people like the fact that even though this book is impossibly heavy, I want to say it's one of the heaviest books I've read in a long time, it's mainly because it's good binding and paper, but there are people who love the artifactualness of the book, of the fact that there it is, and know that their favorite passage is somewhere in the upper left-hand corner, about a third of the way through the book. I'm sure many people, I don't know how many people are in this room with us, but many people have had the experience of celebrating the bookiness of the book. When you go into a bookstore or a library, I'll say a bookstore because it's more likely to have multiple copies of the same book. It's the beginning of the semester, and you've got to read Pride and Prejudice, and good thing too, because you should read it. And there were 40 copies of it on the bookshelf because it's a class with a lot of enrollments. It's very hard for you to appreciate that this identically shaped book was written by someone who didn't have it before she started, who had to actually create it and make it and shape it. It's hard to go back to the inspiration, the magic, the exploration before it became an artifact. And I think one of the things this book is celebrating is the imagination, the inventiveness that goes into writing. And where do we see that? We see that in the novel that we're reading. As wacky as Athon's story is about changing into a donkey, and then to a fish, and then to a crow, each time becoming more mobile, more adventurous. As wacky as that is, the story that we're reading is as wacky. And that's what Doerr is doing. He's not just telling us that literature is capable of doing inventive, audacious things. He does it. And along the way, he makes several serious points that I'm going to repeat. One is that life can be endlessly discovered and explored at different stages of our lives, young, middle-aged, old, different stages of civilization, different stages of technology. Think about the world of Aristophanes, who wrote The Birds in the 4th century BC, where Cloud Cuckoo Land was invented, or Antonius Diogenes, who wrote the story that was something like this story, or the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century, and on and on. What was it like for people to be people then, when there were different kinds of cultures and certainly different kinds of technology? But wherever you go, there you are. And the book suggests that in those different phases, part of the glory of life is imagination, writing, books, and children. It begins with a book being given to a niece. It begins with two young people in Constantinople. It continues through a library that has young school children and Seymour, who is himself only a teenager. And it ends with Constance, first as a teenager, and then later on, reading a book to a child, where the last words are said, mother to son, yes, it's true. The book is true, by which she doesn't mean factual, she means true to the experience of life. So that's one major point of the book about books and writing and exploration. But it's also a caution that utopias are only to be found in the imagination, and that it's perfectly understandable that people dream of utopias. People thought that when Thomas More, the Renaissance scholar, wrote the work Utopia, that he meant that it was a beautiful place, a perfect place, in Eden, as if it were spelled Eutopia, EU for perfect or beautiful, topia for place. But he was a Latin scholar and he knew how to spell. He called it utopia without the E, because the U in front of topia means no place. In his rendering, the man who comes back to tell, I said to Thomas More, I'm sorry, it's Erasmus, please excuse me. It's Erasmus who wrote Utopia. He come, do I have that right? No, Thomas More and his friend Erasmus. Anyway, in the story, the traveler who comes back and reports on this perfect system, it's clear that it's not a perfect system. It's like a Soviet state. Everything is figured out by reason. And the last action of the book is the host, Thomas More, says to his guest, the man who's telling the story of Utopia, you seem very tired. Why don't you stay overnight? We'll have some supper and we'll continue in the morning. That's the end of the novel. And Thomas More's point is there's more perfection in a host understanding that his visitor is tired, in need of food, need of sleep. There's more perfection in that simple act of what in the context of the book is Christian kindness than there is in any organized system of how to make a perfect world. So the second major point of the book is it's understandable that we will keep thinking about perfection. And sometimes the people who work at perfection wind up inventing things like driverless cars or AI or whatever your favorite fast food is. But sometimes they make atomic bombs. And sometimes they make things that have an overflow into infectious disease. Or sometimes they wind up eliminating the climate, the environment. And part of the message of the book, implicitly, is that some things can be saved, like a text, through hard work, dumb luck, collaboration. But other things that you want to save aren't things, like people, like the environment. You cannot fix the environment by guessing at the missing phrase because it's not an artifact, it's not a thing, it's something bigger than that. And the book is absolutely serious about the fact that as we search for utopias, one of the things we're living with is the loss of our own environment. So I do think that is brilliantly interested in the natural human tendency to wish for perfection, the recognition that disaster and loss and chagrin are all around us, but that it's eventually, ultimately, a hopeful book, not only that somebody like Seymour gets rehabilitated, not only that the text gets through in some version, but that Constance gets to read the book to her son because whatever's happening, books go on. And I do think it's fitting that it's dedicated to librarians. I think many people have not encountered this book because the title is not inviting. If you're not someone who's aware of Aristophanes or read The Birds, you probably don't know what Cloud Cuckoo Land is. I know people in my own family in orbit who were put off by the weight of it, and some people were put off by the way it began and thought it only got interesting 100 pages in. But I hope those of you who are here who read it enjoyed it. If some of you are here because you're here to hear the lecture and not read the book, that's perfectly fine always. But I hope that this might encourage you to read it. This series has three very, very good books. This is the most recent. This is the one most obviously suited to the topic. And again, I hope if you haven't read it, but now that you've heard the talk, you'll be inspired to read it, and perhaps the talk will make that easier. I told Lucy that I haven't timed this talk because I don't think of it as a lecture in a formal sense, and that I would make sure to leave room for questions either at the end or along the way. So I see that we're at halftime, and I'm wondering if I could invite Lucy to forward to me in conversation. She could read to me. If any of you want to put a question to me in the chat to Lucy. Lucy, how many people do we have here?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, not a lot.
No, I mean it exploded. We started with only two. Welcome everybody. No, I don't. I'm seven most important people showed up. This is good. The reason I asked about the number is there are so few of you that if several of you have a question, we can get to it. It's not that I can't find more to say, but the whole point of these kinds of discussions or these kinds of programs are to have as much discussion as possible. So if there's anyone in the room who has a question, especially about anything I said in the last half hour, or about the book on its own terms, or about the trajectory of the series, there'll be time and no pressure. If there are no questions, I can talk some more. Ask my kids.
Does anyone have anything to say? Nope. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, so one of the histories of books is the idea that there's something supernaturally powerful about them, that they're connected to the notion. And again, I'm talking about the broader issue of language discovery, exploration as part of the series, because I think I've covered enough about the structure of the book and its format. And I realize some of you may not have read it, in which case I'd rather not keep talking about a book that you've yet to read and hope you'll read it. But books always had a certain kind of allure. First of all, writing was seen as magical because some people could write and some people couldn't. And writing, like any other kind of code, looks like something unintelligible to people who don't know how to read it. And people who read it have some kind of special knowledge. You may not know that the word grammar, the word about putting sentences together, is etymologically related to the word glamour with an L, that people who knew grammar were thought to have glamour, not in the sense of the fashion magazine, but in the sense that they had a kind of charisma, they had a kind of magic because they knew how to make sentences. They knew the secret of language. Remember, the Old Testament begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That there's something about the language that is powerful. Why is it that the word for a magician's effect, spell, is the same as spelling a word? Why does a spell that a witch can cast over Snow White, why is that the same word as spelling in a spelling book? Because you need to know the right words. If you don't know the words, you can't do the spell. Abracadabra, hocus pocus. If you don't know how to spell the spell, you can't do the magic. And so for many, many centuries, it was thought that there was some power in words, in people who knew the words, in the books that codified the words. Also, books were very expensive in the Middle Ages, later on in the Renaissance. It was not uncommon for scholars to have to go to a teacher's home and read the books on his premises. There were no hers then. And then go back and study from their notes because they couldn't afford to own the book and they couldn't be trusted to take it out of the residence. Lending libraries only started in the Western world in the 18th century, and books were quite expensive. In the 19th century, in Europe and England, when an explosion of literacy happened, books weren't published as books, they were published in magazines, in installments, and only at the end of a year of those installments, or sometimes two, Dickens published this way, you could buy the book as a book, a triple decker, but it would cost a lot of money and could only be afforded by upper middle class families. So books have a lot of heft to them. And the idea that you can imagine something that is not true. When Constance says to her son, it's true, she's telling him as a child, not a fairy tale, that don't let the fact that this might be made up let you treat it with less seriousness. It's absolutely true that this story is the work, credible work of imagination. And I think that's important to remember. We like to read books that are not true. That's why so many people who are in book groups, and I had the high point of my career, had 7 monthly book groups with 10 or so people in each. They'd much rather read fiction than nonfiction. Nonfiction is true. It's not that they're not interested in learning. They're interested in the inventiveness of a story that is made up but still credible. That is true to human experience. And I think that's another thing that the book is celebrating. If any of you in your professional or student or avocational lives have ever been involved in the restoration or preservation of something, if you've ever been involved, again, academically, professionally, as a hobby, in restoring something, you know the joy of making something last. It's on a continuum with, if you've ever misplaced something, maybe something not even very important, and you come across it after a long time of not having it, there's a joy that it's still here, that it hasn't evaporated, that it hasn't gone away. It may be something absolutely insignificant, or maybe something trivial but important to you, like a ticket stub for a first date. When you find it again, it's an extraordinary thing. If you know the movie The Verdict, I hope you don't think I'm rambling. I'm trying to argue that this thing that he's celebrating so splendidly in the book is everywhere in human life. If you know the Paul Newman movie, James Mason was in it too, The Verdict, it has to do with a question about whether a doctor who is an anesthesiologist didn't notice the time that the patient last had food. And a woman who was a nurse at the time gave testimony that somebody changed the admission form to make it that she had eaten earlier in the day, which would have meant the doctor was not guilty of malpractice. And they find that nurse. I can see the actress. Lindsay Krause is the actress. And she was forced out of the Catholic hospital because they knew that she knew the truth. And remarkably, Paul Newman, down on his luck, drunken attorney, finds her. And when she gives testimony, James Mason, who is a killer lawyer for the Catholic Archdiocese of Brooklyn, says, "We just have your word for it. It's not like you have the documents with you." And he turns away, ignoring her. And she says, "No, I have them right here." Now, this would never hold up in court. You have to allow movies to be movies. But she kept the original document. All these years later, when she never thought she'd be called on, she was hiding in another city, I think in New York, and she's called. And of course, the judge allows it, which they would never do. Who knows what happened? But it persisted. The papers are still there. Remarkable. And if you've ever been involved in, again, in anything where something was gone and has come back, it is cause for celebration that things don't just disappear, although sometimes they do. And the poignancy of the novel is that the environment is not such a thing. The environment is not something you can get a group of kids together and a woman on a virtual library and you can fix by figuring out what it should have said. It's something delicate and dying, and the novel takes that very seriously. So I'll stop again to ask if there's questions about anything in the novel or anything I've said. I wonder if the people, the 7 or so people, wouldn't mind just saying in the chat to Margaret, I just saw that Margaret's here, hi Margaret, to Lucy, that whether you've read the book or not. I'm not judging you, I'm not asking for names, but I'm wondering how many of the 7 of you in attendance tonight read the book. Could you just say read or not read to Lucy? It'll give me a sense of how to wrap up.
Lucy read.
Not like those of you who haven't read it won't be asked to leave early, okay? It's just.
I'm Deanna. I read the book, and I do have a question when you're finished taking the read or not read poll.
Okay,
Thanks.
who's that talking now?
Deanna.
Hi,
Hi.
go ahead, ask. She can count while you were
Camden
asking.
read too.
Say again?
Camden also read it. Unfortunately, when it first came out, so
Okay,
it
so
slipped a little bit.
I'll let her ask her question and then you'll tell me how many read the book. Go on, ask away.
Okay, so I just read the book for this lecture, and I loved it because I've always loved libraries, and I've spent my entire life from childhood
Did you
in
read
libraries.
within the program?
Yes.
Oh, good for us.
Yeah. And I had read Anthony Doerr's other book, All the Light We Cannot See, and so I thought, oh, this has to be good. He's a great author. And then read this, and it was incredible. You know, all the themes I could kind of recognize and relate to. It was very meaningful to me, loving books and loving libraries. And my question to you is, I wonder if you saw what I saw, which was a theme also of redemption throughout, with at least 4 of the characters, Anna, Omer, Zeno, and Seymour. I couldn't quite see it with Constance, but I wonder if that somehow is different for her because she was the one who brought the book back. And I wonder if how that redemption ties into the other themes of the book and the book lasting.
So I absolutely agree about the redemption with all the characters you name, whether they're thinking consciously that they have to save themselves or improve themselves. There is a way in which every one of the characters you name, we'll leave Constance aside for just a moment, does have a kind of redemption. Not only do they persist and succeed, but there's that sense of redemption in the quasi-spiritual sense that it's not just succeeding in human terms. Zeno becomes a hero, not because he's fighting a war, or at least not the war in Korea, but because he is willing to sacrifice himself to save those children. I do think that's, you're absolutely right about those people. And Seymour is the last such example because he's not a bad person. He is on the spectrum. He has his own impairments. He's been partly seduced into people playing on his sympathies for that owl and for nature and flora and fauna. What I see about Constance is there is a kind of redemption there when you think that she was thinking that she was going on a journey to go to a new planet because the Earth was dying. And although she herself might not particularly be redeemed, she does provide the key to the solution of the problem that everyone else's redemption is tied up in, even though Seymour is negatively tied to it. And it is true that she liberates herself from her captivity in that vault, and her chance is not to repopulate and make a new Earth, but to go back to the Earth she left, the Earth that's the same Earth she left. That's why the name of the village reads the same backwards and forwards. And to preserve it as a mother would preserve it in reading to her child. She is constant and so doesn't have to have the same kind of redemption as the others. But I think that's a such an observation. Thank you for the comment and the question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Lucy, how many people read the book?
3.5. One isn't midway.
3.5 of 7?
Yeah, or maybe it's 4.5, counting me.
You're perfect. Okay, all right. I only say that because I don't want to go on and on if most of the people haven't read the book, because I'd rather you read the book and talk about other things. Are there other comments or questions?
Yes, there is a question from Margaret. Wonder about the trend in puzzle books comprised of disparate parts that the reader has to figure out how the pieces fit together.
Margaret, I don't know what kind of puzzle book you mean. Could you explain further? You mean puzzle in the plot? I don't know the term puzzle book.
Yes, as in it's not a chronological timeline. You know, it's not obvious if you're just
So it's
reading through it.
prose and you have to figure out how to unscramble it?
Yes,
Now, is that a popular genre? I'm unaware of it.
it seems to be more prevalent now.
Okay, and Margaret, what kind of plots are they? Are they young adult books? Are they romances? Are they mysteries?
No, just general contemporary fiction, I would say.
Yeah.
You know, like it's very popular now to have different narrators for every chapter flipping around all the time, and you're supposed to figure out.
Okay,
know,
well, having different narrators every time is a lot older than 21st century puzzle plots. Is that what you mean by a puzzle book?
Well, this one in the 3 different parts goes even further. And I mean, it could throw a reader into total confusion if you're not really working at it.
Well, you mean the novel we're talking about tonight?
Yes, yes.
Okay, it's more than 3 parts, just to be
Well,
clear.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let me now say I'm very familiar with books that are told out of order. I wouldn't call them puzzle books. I would call them books. And I'll tell you why. So it's a very common thing for narration of books written in the 20th and 21st century to be disordered. One of the reasons is this. When the novel first came into being in England, it was because in the 18th century, people decided, regular people not just kings and queens and heroes, could have their lives written about. And what the novel tried to do, Daniel Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, Tristram Shandy, is it tried to make the interior life of everyday people visible to other people. But the first kind of novels that were written were what are called epistolary novels. And I'll say to everybody, this is an excellent question because it's going to give me a chance to make an excellent answer. I'm not making a joke there. Thank you, Margaret. Epistolary novels are novels, letters. Two people write back and forth. The entire novel are just two people writing to each other. Those were the first novels. In fact, Jane Austen almost wrote Pride and Prejudice as an epistolary novel. And why would that be? Because it got rid of a narrator and it left the author with two credible characters and how they talk to each other in letters back and forth. It was also a fad at the time because many people wrote letters all the time. That is, they didn't want to complicate a book, let's say a love story between two people, with a lot of other people. And then it expanded to having a narrator. And in the beginning, the narrator who told you the story was absolutely telling you the truth. It was inconceivable, not a narrator who's in the book like Nick Carraway or Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn, a narrator telling you a story the way they do in Jane Austen or Dickens. It was inconceivable in the early 19th century that the narrator wouldn't be telling you the truth. No one imagined writing a story told by a person who was lying because novels were simple. When they got more complicated, it turned out the person telling you the story may have been lying or is absolutely lying or is misrepresenting. And then to talk about what Margaret calls a puzzle plot, novelists got bored with telling stories in sequence because they know that a lot of life is not experienced in sequence. If during my enthralling talk just now, some of you wandered back to your time in elementary school, the story of your evening would have to go back and forth in time. The great surrealist director Louis Brunel was asked at a film festival why his movies never had a beginning, a middle, and an end. He said they do, but not in that order. Not in that order. One reason they do it is to try to represent more of the disordered nature of life. Nobody lives their life one wing after another in consciousness that is a complete stream. That's one reason. Another reason is that they realize that the same way some people like figuring out a mystery before they read the conclusion, some people like to read a novel that challenges them to make sense of what's going on. So if you haven't read Atonement yet, you have my sympathies. It's a great novel. When you read it, you find out that one of the people who is in the novel has written the end of the novel you're reading. And you say, well, what could be more gimmicky than that? No, it's because she is so talented and so humane because she's done something for which she has to atone, that her atonement takes over the novel. There'd be no better way to express it than letting her write the book that she's in. That's part of what the novel's talking about. So I do think those books are sometimes part of writers trying to make their novels more complex because we're in the 21st century. But sometimes it's because they think that's the way to represent life.
Thank you.
You know, when you see paintings of people in the 16th century or the 15th century or the 13th century, I mean, really long time ago, forget the clothing and the decor. The way their faces look, the way their faces are constructed is different from if you saw a realistic painting from last month. It's not just that they didn't have the right paint, it's that the style wasn't to draw the face just the way it was. It was to do it in a style that we would recognize as Grandma Moses or I'm trying to think of the great Dutch painters. Anyway, you don't know that you're in a cultural period while you're in it. If you're any men or women here of a certain age, 40 or older, I'm 71, and you've seen a picture of yourself from when you're in your 50s and you think, did I actually wear my hair that way? Yes, everybody wore that hair that way. Did I actually wear a suit with those lapels? Yes, because when you were wearing it, it was the thing to do. You don't realize it. And then things change. And part of what the novel does is it says, I can't keep writing, novelists, in 2024, the kind of novel that represents people that were written in the 1960s, because things are different. Human nature changes. It does. It changes, not in its elements, but in its expression. And so I think you're always finding novels that are different from the novels that you grew up on. Although there will always be those other novels.
Mm.
I will say this because it occurred to me as I myself was talking, that Socrates was suspicious of writing as something to do because he prided himself on memorizing long tracts of philosophy. And every time he gave a speech, which was not infrequently, he committed it to memory, which he thought was good for his oration, good for his memory, and probably good for his soul. And he actually believed that the art of writing would mean that people would lose the art of memory. Well, he may be wrong about that, but this has eroded people's memory, the iPhone, because you don't have to remember, you can look it up. I have been in classes, I haven't taught in a while at Yale, but I did. And I would say, I can't remember the name of this. And 8 students would be reaching for their phone to tell me. And I would say, I have a phone too, I can look it up. But I like the joy of remembering. You've all had this experience, I hope, of actually thinking, I think it begins with an R. Wait. Oh, and then you.
Mm-hmm.
I say this in connection to tonight's conversation because he was fearful that the writing and having it concretized as something solid and fixed would take away from the spirit of his mind. And what I want to say about the novel, this novel, is that the celebration of the text in no way diminishes the fecundity of people's wit and imagination. It's so clear that this novelist is invested in the give and take of imagination, discovery, exploration. The book is filled with it. I say again, when Lucy mentioned this series to me months ago and said I could do 3 novels, this book leapt out at me because it's a perfect fit for the idea of exploration and discovery through reading being a part of human culture.
Hey, Mark, did you mean Vermeer?
I did mean Vermeer, thank you. Did you look it up on your iPhone?
No.
God bless you. You know, talking about words and movies. So in the movie of A Man for All Seasons by Robert Bolt, there is a play version which he wrote, but the scene I'm about to describe to you, I don't believe is in the play, which I've seen too. So Thomas More, who has refused to do what Henry VIII has asked him to do against his conscience, has been kept in the tower to be cross-examined and interrogated. And as he goes to take the ferry or canoe, canal boat, whatever, back to his estate on the Thames, the boatman puts out his candle because he knows that Thomas More is persona non grata and he can't be seen giving him a ride. So he walks a long way back to his estate, and along the way he runs into his daughter, Margaret. There you go, Margaret. And Margaret tells him that he's in big trouble because the king has designed an oath that every citizen of the realm must sign, or else it will be an act of treason. And this the actress playing Margaret is Susanna York, a very talented, now deceased English actress. And he says to her, "What are the words, Margaret? What are the words?" And she says, and Margaret, his actual daughter, was a scholar. He didn't have sons, so he raised his daughter the way he would have raised a son at the time and taught his daughter Latin, which women typically weren't taught, even the daughters of noblemen. And she said, "What does it matter about the words? You know what it means." And he said, "No, an oath is made up of words. It may be that the oath is so poorly constructed that I could agree to it without betraying my conscience." Now, that's a lawyerly comment. Before he was a saint, before he was a sir, he was an attorney. And I respect attorneys and their respect for words. I have a son who's an attorney. It may be possible that the person who created this document wasn't attentive enough to what words mean, and he might actually be able to swear without betraying his conscience. The reason I've gone to this length is the words matter. What are the words? What are the words? And when students in my classes summarize a poem in their argument about why they think it means this, and without realizing it, substitute one word for another word, I say to them, "Wait, he didn't use that word. It's a completely different word." "Well, you know what I mean." "No, it's a completely different word. You can't change that word to this word sloppily. The poet picked that word." You can read a 500-page novel and that there could be 2 words on every page that you don't know the meaning of at all. Either English is not your strong suit, either this person writes a fancy kind of diction, whatever it might be. There might be 1,000 words in this 500-page book that you don't know the meaning of. And it's likely that your understanding of the book will not be damaged. But you could read a 14-line sonnet by Shakespeare and not know the meaning of one word and miss the entire point of the poem. I'm not exaggerating. Not knowing that this word means this and not that may completely keep the poem from your understanding. And students all the time would read a poem, not know a word, and just keep going. So, great fans of language. We're at 8 o'clock. Thank you, those of you who came. Thank those of you who contributed, all of you, your attention and the questions. And I want to say to you, the next 2 books are very good books, great books in different ways from each other. And from this book, I hope you return. And thank you, Lucy, again for hosting me.